For more than 6 centuries, a single family stood at the very heart of European power. They did not begin as the continent's greatest warriors. They were not its wealthiest dynasty, nor did they inherit a crown so mighty that no rival dared challenge them. Yet by the height of their influence, members of the House of Habsburg ruled an empire stretching across Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, vast regions of Italy, and overseas possessions so immense that people claimed the sun never set upon their domains. What makes their rise remarkable is not simply the scale of what they built, but how they built it. Unlike many of Europe's great dynasties, the Habsburgs expanded their power not primarily through conquest, but through carefully arranged marriages. Generation after generation, wedding vows accomplished what countless armies could not. This is the extraordinary story of how an obscure noble family, whose fortunes began with a modest castle overlooking the hills of present-day Switzerland, transformed itself into the most influential royal house in European history. It is also the story of how that same dynasty, after centuries of astonishing success, gradually became the architect of its own decline. Before we uncover how they pulled off one of history's greatest political triumphs, take a second to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy well-researched documentaries like this. Every subscription helps us continue bringing the biggest stories in history to life, and there's plenty more to come. Now, here's something I want you to think about. Imagine standing in a small Austrian village around the year 1200. A local noble family passes by on horseback. Outside the surrounding valleys, almost no one knows their name. There is nothing to suggest they are destined for greatness. Would you have believed that one day their descendants would rule over nearly half of Europe? Let me know your answer in the comments, and as we follow their journey, see if your opinion changes. The Habsburgs are one of history's most misunderstood dynasties. Many people remember the famous Habsburg Jaw. Others think immediately of the assassination that ignited the First World War. Some picture little more than aging emperors presiding over glittering palaces and elaborate ceremonies. But those fragments barely scratch the surface. The real story is far more extraordinary. It is a story of relentless patience, remarkable fortune, political calculation, and marriages treated as instruments of conquest. It is also a cautionary tale about power itself, about what happens when a family becomes so determined to preserve its bloodline that the very strategy which built its empire ultimately begins to destroy it from within. Over the next 90 minutes, we will trace that entire journey, from a forgotten fortress known as Hawk's Castle to the final Habsburg emperor surrendering the throne of an empire that had dominated Europe for centuries. By the time we reach the end, you'll understand not only how one family shaped the course of European history, but why the map of Europe looks the way it does today. The story of the Habsburgs does not begin in the grand palaces of Vienna or the glittering courts of emperors. It begins much more modestly in the rolling hills of what is now northern Switzerland, in a region known as the Aargau. Around the year 1020, a local nobleman named Radbot ordered the construction of a stone fortress overlooking the Reuss River. It was a practical stronghold, built to protect his family's lands and project authority over the surrounding countryside. Yet according to medieval tradition, the castle earned its name from an unexpected visitor. A hawk was said to have landed upon its walls during its construction, inspiring the name Habichtsburg, the Hawk's Castle. As the generations passed, everyday speech gradually shortened the name. Habichtsburg became simply Habsburg. Few could have imagined that this modest fortress would one day lend its name to the most powerful dynasty Europe had ever known. At this stage, however, there was nothing especially remarkable about the family. The Habsburgs were counts, respectable members of the lower ranks of the medieval nobility, but they stood far beneath the great dukes, princes, and kings who dominated European politics. Their possessions consisted of scattered estates in the Upper Rhine Valley, parts of Alsace, and territories within what is now Switzerland. Across the German-speaking world, hundreds of noble families occupied much the same position. Each competed with neighboring lords for influence, arranged advantageous marriages, defended inherited lands, and searched constantly for opportunities to expand. So why did the Habsburgs succeed where so many others disappeared? The answer was not military brilliance or spectacular victories. It was discipline and extraordinary patience. Generation after generation, the family avoided one of the greatest dangers facing medieval noble houses, dividing their inheritance among too many heirs until their wealth and influence simply dissolved. Instead, the Habsburgs concentrated their possessions whenever possible. Family members secured influential positions within the church, bringing both income and political connections. They earned the trust of more powerful rulers through loyal service and were rewarded with additional lands and privileges. When neighboring relatives died without heirs, the Habsburgs were often perfectly positioned to inherit their estates. It was not an explosive rise. It was a slow, deliberate accumulation of power, carried out over centuries. To understand why this strategy proved so effective, we first need to understand the political world they inhabited. The Holy Roman Empire was unlike the centralized kingdoms of England or France. It was not a single nation, but an enormous patchwork of hundreds of duchies, bishoprics, counties, free cities, and principalities stretching across Central Europe. Each possessed its own ruler, its own laws, and its own ambitions. Above them all stood the Holy Roman Emperor. But unlike most monarchs, the emperor did not automatically pass his crown to his eldest son. The imperial title was elective, chosen by a select group of powerful princes known as the prince-electors. That single fact shaped the destiny of the empire for centuries. No dynasty, no matter how influential, could assume it would hold the imperial crown forever. Every generation faced the same challenge. Alliances had to be cultivated, rivals outmaneuvered, and the support of the electors won all over again. It was a political landscape filled with uncertainty, where fortunes could rise or collapse in the space of a single election. For ambitious families, it was an unforgiving contest. For patient ones, it offered extraordinary opportunity. By the middle of the 13th century, the head of the Habsburg family was a count named Rudolf. Tall, politically astute, and remarkably patient, Rudolf had spent years strengthening his family's position through careful diplomacy, calculated loyalty, and advantageous marriages. He also fathered a large family, giving him valuable opportunities to weave the Habsburg name into noble houses across Europe through strategic alliances. Most importantly, Rudolf possessed one quality that would unexpectedly change everything. The most powerful princes of the empire did not see him as a threat. To them, he appeared to be a capable but relatively minor nobleman, exactly the sort of candidate who could wear the imperial crown without becoming powerful enough to dominate everyone else. It was a miscalculation that would alter the course of European history. By the year 1273, the Holy Roman Empire was drifting toward crisis. For almost 20 years, the imperial throne had stood vacant, disputed, or too weak to impose meaningful authority. Historians would later remember this turbulent era as the Great Interregnum. In the absence of a powerful emperor, the empire began to fracture. Great nobles fought private wars against one another. Ambitious lords expanded their own territories by force, and bands of robber knights turned once safe trade routes into hunting grounds for merchants and travelers. Across much of the German world, law and order had become little more than an illusion. the responsibility for restoring stability rested with a remarkably small group of men. The next ruler would be chosen by the prince-electors, the empire's most influential princes. Yet despite the chaos surrounding them, they had little desire to place a truly powerful monarch on the throne. A strong king might restore order, but he would also reclaim the authority they had accumulated during 2 decades of political instability. Their ideal candidate was someone who possessed enough prestige to wear the imperial crown, yet not enough power to threaten their own independence. Their search eventually settled on an unlikely choice: Count Rudolf of Habsburg. To the prince-electors, Rudolf appeared to be the perfect compromise. He was respected, experienced, and politically capable. But his family's resources seemed modest compared with the great dynasties of the empire. They believed he could stabilize the realm while remaining dependent on the princes who had elevated him. It would prove to be one of the greatest political miscalculations in medieval European history. Rudolf accepted the crown, but instead of acting as a cautious figurehead, he immediately began exercising the full authority of his new office. His greatest challenge came from one man: King Ottokar II of Bohemia. Ottokar was among the most formidable rulers in Central Europe. Wealthy, ambitious, and militarily powerful, he had used the years of imperial disorder to assemble an enormous realm. Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and several neighboring territories had all fallen under his control, creating a kingdom that stretched from Bohemia deep toward the Adriatic Sea. Confident in his own strength, Ottokar refused to recognize Rudolf's election, dismissing him as little more than an insignificant count who had somehow stumbled onto an imperial throne. War became unavoidable. In 1278, the 2 rulers met on the broad plains north of Vienna, near the Morava River, at the Battle of Marchfeld. It was one of the largest cavalry battles of the medieval era, bringing together thousands of armored horsemen in a struggle that would determine the future of Central Europe. Rudolf's army, strengthened by crucial Hungarian allies, secured a decisive victory. Ottokar was killed on the battlefield, and with his death, the balance of power shifted almost overnight. Most rulers would have celebrated the victory and moved on. Rudolf saw something much greater. The defeated king's Austrian territories now lay within his grasp. Rather than allowing these lands to remain temporary possessions of the imperial crown, where they could easily pass to another dynasty after his death, Rudolf made a decision that would define the future of his family. He invested Austria, Styria, and the neighboring duchies in his own sons as hereditary Habsburg possessions, ensuring they would belong not to the empire, but to his bloodline. It was one of the most consequential political decisions in European history. In a single generation, the Habsburgs ceased to be a regional noble family rooted in Switzerland and Alsace. They became the hereditary rulers of one of the richest and most strategically important regions in Central Europe. From that moment onward, the center of gravity of the dynasty shifted eastward to the Danube. Vienna, not the Hawk's Castle in Switzerland, would become the true heart of the House of Habsburg. For the next 6.5 centuries, despite triumphs, disasters, revolutions, and world wars, the dynasty would never willingly surrender that position. Their rise to greatness had truly begun. Winning Austria was a remarkable achievement. Keeping it would prove far more difficult. The decades that followed Rudolf's victory were some of the most challenging in the history of the young Habsburg dynasty. Their spectacular rise had captured Europe's attention, but it had also created powerful enemies determined to prevent the family from becoming too influential. The first setback came almost immediately. The imperial crown slipped from Habsburg hands. The prince-electors had learned an important lesson from Rudolf's reign. They had elevated a man they believed would be easy to control, only to watch him strengthen both the empire and his own dynasty. They had no intention of repeating that mistake. Instead, the imperial title passed back and forth between rival houses, particularly the Luxembourgs and the Wittelsbachs, whose rulers were equally determined to prevent any single family from establishing a permanent grip on the throne. For much of the 14th century, the Habsburgs found themselves pushed back into the ranks of powerful regional princes. Rather than expanding their influence, they spent decades fighting simply to preserve what Rudolf had won. Then came an even deeper blow. It struck at the very birthplace of the dynasty. In the rugged valleys of the Swiss Alps, resentment toward Habsburg rule had been growing for years. The fiercely independent mountain communities had little desire to remain under the authority of distant nobles. Gradually, they formed alliances for their mutual defense, laying the foundations of what would eventually become the Swiss Confederation. When conflict erupted, the Habsburgs expected another straightforward victory. Instead, they suffered humiliation. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, lightly armed Swiss infantry used the narrow mountain terrain to devastating effect. As heavily armored Habsburg knights struggled through confined passes, the Swiss launched a sudden assault, overwhelming one of the finest cavalry forces in Central Europe. The defeat sent shockwaves throughout the empire, proving that disciplined foot soldiers fighting on favorable ground could destroy armies of mounted nobles once thought nearly invincible. The disaster was not the last. 70 years later, at the Battle of Sempach, another Habsburg army marched into Switzerland determined to restore its authority. Instead, it met another crushing defeat. Duke Leopold III himself was killed in the fighting, and once again the Swiss infantry shattered a force of armored knights. Slowly but relentlessly, the dynasty that had taken its very name from a castle in Switzerland was driven away from its ancestral homeland. It would never truly return. The long conflict also gave rise to one of Europe's most enduring legends. According to tradition, a local marksman named William Tell refused to bow before a Habsburg official. As punishment, he was ordered to shoot an apple from the head of his own son with a single arrow. Whether William Tell was a real historical figure remains uncertain, but the legend endured because it captured something genuine. It reflected the fierce resentment many Swiss communities felt toward Habsburg rule and transformed that resistance into a story that would echo through the centuries. Repeated military setbacks forced the Habsburgs to rethink how they pursued power. If brute force could not always secure their ambitions, perhaps politics, symbolism, and careful manipulation could accomplish what armies sometimes could not. No one understood this better than Duke Rudolf IV. During the middle of the 14th century, he unveiled an extraordinary collection of documents claiming that the rulers of Austria possessed ancient rights and privileges unlike those of any other princes within the empire. The documents elevated Austria's status, introduced the prestigious new title of Archduke, and asserted that its ruler enjoyed sweeping honors and an almost independent position within the imperial hierarchy. It was an audacious claim. There was only one problem. The documents were complete forgeries. Known today as the Privilegium Maius, they had been fabricated in Rudolf's own lifetime and carefully designed to appear centuries old. Before long, respected scholars examined the charters and exposed the deception, declaring them inauthentic. For many dynasties, that would have been the end of the story. For the Habsburgs, it was only the beginning. Rather than abandoning the claim, they simply continued acting as though it were true, year after year, generation after generation. As the family's influence steadily increased, yesterday's fiction slowly evolved into tomorrow's political reality. Eventually, later emperors formally recognized the title of Archduke, granting legal authority to an honor that had begun as little more than an elaborate forgery. It was a remarkable lesson in how power often works. Sometimes history is shaped not only by facts, but by ideas repeated with enough confidence, patience, and influence that the world eventually accepts them as reality. Rudolf IV achieved far more than forged charters during his brief life. He founded the University of Vienna, began the ambitious expansion of St. Stephen's Cathedral, and transformed Vienna into a city worthy of a rising dynasty. His energy earned him the enduring nickname, the Founder. Yet he died before reaching the age of 30. Even so, his legacy reached far beyond his short reign. He had taught the Habsburgs a lesson they would never forget. Prestige could be created, legitimacy could be cultivated. With enough patience, today's impossible ambition could become tomorrow's accepted truth. It was a lesson the dynasty would soon apply on an even greater stage. And this time, instead of forged documents, their most powerful weapon would be marriage. The lesson Rudolf IV left behind was simple but profound. Power did not always belong to the strongest. Sometimes it belonged to those who could wait the longest. No Habsburg would embody that principle more completely than Frederick III. If earlier generations had fought to preserve the dynasty, Frederick would ensure its survival through sheer endurance. He ascended to the imperial throne in the middle of the 15th century and remained there for more than half a century, making his reign one of the longest in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. It was an extraordinary achievement, though not for the reasons most rulers are remembered. Frederick was no legendary conqueror. To many of his contemporaries, he was an infuriating man to follow. They regarded him as painfully cautious, stubborn, indecisive, and almost incapable of acting with urgency. His reign was marked by repeated setbacks. He lost battles. He surrendered territory. At one point, even his own brother rebelled against him, trapping the emperor inside his palace in Vienna, where Frederick found himself negotiating for food while under siege. His fortunes seemed to deteriorate even further when the brilliant and ambitious Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, launched a series of campaigns into the Austrian lands. Corvinus captured Vienna itself, forcing the Holy Roman Emperor to abandon his own capital and wander through his territories as a ruler without a seat of government. Measured by the standards of history's great military heroes, Frederick appears almost a failure. But appearances can be deceptive. Frederick understood something that many of his more dynamic rivals never did. Time can be the most powerful weapon a ruler possesses. Empires built through relentless conquest often collapse just as quickly as they are assembled. Victorious generals grow old, powerful enemies die, alliances fracture, rebellions exhaust themselves. A patient ruler needs only one thing above all else: to remain standing when everyone else has fallen. Again and again, Frederick did exactly that. The greatest proof came with Matthias Corvinus. The king who had humiliated the emperor and seized Vienna died unexpectedly, without leaving a legitimate heir. Almost overnight, the political structure he had spent years constructing began to unravel. The territories he had conquered slipped away, rival factions emerged, and the Hungarian sphere of influence rapidly weakened. Frederick, still alive after decades of adversity, quietly reclaimed much of what had once been lost. He had not overwhelmed his enemies. He had simply outlived them. His reign also marked the closing chapter of an ancient imperial tradition. Frederick III became the last Holy Roman Emperor ever crowned in Rome by the Pope, bringing to an end a ceremony that had symbolized the union of imperial and papal authority for centuries. It was the final echo of the medieval empire before Europe entered a new political age. Yet perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Frederick's personality was a mystery he deliberately left unsolved. Throughout his reign, 5 simple vowels appeared almost everywhere he went. A-E-I-O-U. They were carved into castles, engraved onto drinking vessels, written in official manuscripts, and displayed throughout his possessions across the empire. Frederick never revealed exactly what the letters meant, leaving historians to debate their meaning for generations. The 2 most widely accepted interpretations, one in Latin and the other in German, both express essentially the same extraordinary idea, that all the world is destined to be subject to Austria. It was a breathtaking statement of ambition. Coming from a ruler who spent much of his reign fighting merely to hold on to his own lands, the motto might have seemed almost absurd. Yet Frederick was thinking far beyond his own lifetime. He believed the destiny of the House of Habsburg would not be fulfilled through spectacular victories on the battlefield, but through patience, careful planning, and dynastic strategy. And that conviction would change the course of European history. While rival monarchs pursued glory through war, Frederick invested in something far more enduring. He carefully arranged a marriage for his only surviving son, Maximilian. A marriage that promised wealth, influence, and territories no army could have conquered so easily. That single decision would transform the Habsburgs from an important European dynasty into a global one. The age of survival was ending. The age of Habsburg expansion was about to begin. No one embodied this new chapter of Habsburg history more vividly than Maximilian I. Restless, charismatic, and relentlessly ambitious, Maximilian seemed to possess boundless energy. He was as fascinated by art as he was by politics, as devoted to magnificent armor as he was to military campaigns, and as captivated by music and literature as he was by the pursuit of power. He commissioned lavishly illustrated books celebrating his own achievements, patronized some of the finest artists of his age, staged spectacular knightly tournaments, and carefully crafted an image of himself as the perfect chivalric ruler. History would remember him as the Last Knight. It was a fitting title. Maximilian passionately embraced the ideals of medieval knighthood just as Europe was entering a new era. Gunpowder weapons and cannon were steadily transforming warfare, making the age of armored cavalry increasingly obsolete. Yet while the battlefield was changing, Maximilian remained determined to preserve the romance of the knight, becoming the final great ruler to embody that fading world. His defining moment arrived in 1477. To understand why, we must first look beyond Austria. To the northwest lay the domains of the Dukes of Burgundy. Despite their title, the heart of their power was no longer the French region of Burgundy itself, but the extraordinarily wealthy cities of the Low Countries, roughly modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These were among the richest lands in Europe. Merchant fleets connected them to distant markets. Banks financed rulers across the continent. Workshops produced some of Europe's finest textiles, while painters, craftsmen, and merchants transformed cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels into centers of astonishing prosperity. The Dukes of Burgundy had become so wealthy that in many respects, they eclipsed even the King of France in splendor. Then everything changed. In 1477, Charles the Bold, the last Duke of Burgundy, was killed in battle. His only surviving heir was his 19-year-old daughter, Mary. Overnight, Mary of Burgundy became the most sought-after bride in Europe. Her inheritance represented an unimaginable prize, and the French crown wasted no time trying to seize it. King Louis XI moved quickly, determined to absorb Burgundy's territories before another rival could intervene. But someone else moved even faster. Maximilian. His marriage to Mary of Burgundy became one of the most consequential unions in European history. With a single wedding ceremony, the House of Habsburg gained control of the fabulously wealthy Burgundian inheritance and established itself as a major power in Western Europe. It was exactly the kind of victory Frederick III had envisioned. Not one won through conquest, one won through marriage. The triumph, however, came at a terrible price. France refused to surrender its claims without a fight, dragging Maximilian into years of costly conflict over the Burgundian inheritance. The wars consumed enormous resources and tested his resolve. Then tragedy struck. In 1482, Mary died unexpectedly after a hunting accident in which her horse threw her to the ground. She was only 25 years old. Her death left Maximilian governing the Burgundian lands as regent for their young son, Philip. That proved almost as difficult as fighting France. The prosperous cities of the Low Countries fiercely guarded their ancient privileges and resisted outside interference whenever they believed those freedoms were threatened. Their disputes with Maximilian became so bitter that, in 1488, rebellious citizens in Bruges actually imprisoned the future emperor for several months, forcing him to negotiate for his release. Even so, the broader lesson was unmistakable. One carefully chosen marriage had brought the Habsburgs more wealth, influence, and strategic territory than decades of successful military campaigning could ever have achieved. Frederick III had been right. The marriage bed could accomplish what the battlefield often could not. Maximilian's personality revealed itself in countless remarkable ways, but perhaps nothing illustrates it better than the monument he designed for his own memory. Long before his death, he began planning an enormous imperial tomb. Around it would stand dozens of towering bronze statues depicting his ancestors, legendary heroes, and rulers whom he proudly claimed as part of his lineage. Historical accuracy mattered less than dynastic prestige. Among these imposing figures stood none other than the legendary King Arthur of Britain. Whether Arthur had truly existed was almost beside the point. Maximilian wanted the world to see the Habsburgs as heirs to every great tradition of European kingship, even if that meant adopting mythical ancestors into the family tree. The monument still stands today in Innsbruck. Ironically, Maximilian himself does not. Although the elaborate tomb dominates the church, the emperor was ultimately buried elsewhere, making the magnificent memorial an empty monument to the ruler who commissioned it. Yet Maximilian's achievements extended far beyond image-making. He devoted enormous effort to strengthening the Holy Roman Empire itself. Seeking to bring greater stability to its fragmented political system, he supported sweeping reforms that created institutions such as the Imperial Chamber Court and reorganized the empire into administrative circles intended to improve governance and cooperation among its countless territories. Ambition, however, came at a price. To finance his wars, diplomatic ventures, and political projects, Maximilian borrowed staggering sums from the Fugger banking family of Augsburg. The relationship transformed the Fuggers into the financial powerhouse of Europe, while binding the future of the Habsburg dynasty ever more closely to the emerging world of international finance. But even those reforms would be overshadowed by his greatest achievement. Maximilian perfected the strategy his father had envisioned. Every marriage became a political calculation. Every son, daughter, grandson, and granddaughter became part of a larger dynastic design. Love mattered little. Inheritance mattered above all else. Among the most important of these arrangements was a remarkable double marriage linking his grandchildren with the royal house of Hungary and Bohemia. At the time, it appeared to be little more than another diplomatic alliance. In reality, it was laying the foundations for an empire. Within a single generation, those carefully planned marriages would deliver 2 additional kingdoms into Habsburg hands and prepare the way for the rise of a ruler whose dominions would eclipse those of almost every European monarch before him. The patient strategy that Frederick had imagined and that Maximilian had perfected was about to reach its greatest triumph. the next Habsburg would inherit not merely a kingdom, but a world-spanning empire. Everything the Habsburgs had done for generations was leading to this moment. For centuries, they had chosen patience over haste, alliances over reckless conquest, and marriages over endless wars. Now, at the dawn of the 16th century, that strategy was about to deliver a prize so extraordinary that it almost seems impossible in retrospect. To understand how it happened, you have to follow not just a carefully arranged sequence of marriages, but an equally remarkable chain of untimely deaths. The Habsburg Empire was built as much by funerals as it was by weddings, continuing the dynastic strategy perfected by his father. Maximilian arranged for his son, Philip, better known to history as Philip the Handsome, to marry Joanna of Spain. At first glance, the marriage appeared to be an excellent diplomatic alliance, but hardly a revolutionary one. Spain itself was a rising power unlike anything Europe had seen before. Through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the two greatest Iberian kingdoms had been united under one royal house. Together they completed the Reconquista by capturing Granada in 1492, ending centuries of Muslim rule on the peninsula. In that same remarkable year, they sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, opening the door to overseas territories that would soon pour unimaginable wealth into the Spanish crown. Yet despite Spain's growing importance, almost no one believed Joanna would ever inherit it. She was not first in line. Several relatives stood ahead of her, making the Habsburg marriage valuable, but hardly world-changing. Then fate intervened. One by one, those standing before Joanna in the line of succession disappeared. Her only brother died unexpectedly. Her elder sister passed away. Then her young nephew, the child who had become the next heir, also died. Each tragedy reshaped the succession. Each funeral brought Joanna one step closer to the throne. What had once seemed like an ordinary dynastic marriage suddenly became the greatest political windfall in Europe. Against every expectation, Joanna became heir to the united crowns of Castile and Aragon, along with Spain's possessions in southern Italy and its rapidly expanding overseas empire. The Habsburg gamble had paid off beyond anyone's imagination, but triumph was quickly followed by tragedy. Philip the Handsome died suddenly in 1506, while still in his 20s. Officially, the cause was most likely illness, perhaps typhoid fever. But rumors of poisoning spread almost immediately, adding another layer of mystery to one of Europe's most consequential deaths. Joanna was devastated. Already struggling under immense personal and political pressure, she found herself surrounded by ambitious men who questioned her ability to govern. Declared mentally unfit, she was gradually removed from power and confined for much of the rest of her life. Whether Joanna truly suffered from severe mental illness remains a subject of historical debate. Some historians believe her condition was genuine, while others argue it was exaggerated or deliberately exploited by those who wished to rule in her name. Her father Ferdinand benefited from her removal, and later so did her own son. Whatever the truth, Joanna would spend decades living in isolation, while others governed the empire she had inherited. For the Habsburg dynasty, however, the succession had already passed to the next generation. Philip and Joanna had a son. Raised in the Burgundian Netherlands, speaking French before Spanish, and educated far from the kingdom he would eventually rule, the young prince had little idea of the inheritance awaiting him. Yet destiny had been quietly assembling an empire around him. Consider what was about to fall into his hands. From his grandfather, Maximilian, came the hereditary Habsburg lands of Austria and a powerful claim to the imperial throne. From his grandmother, Mary of Burgundy, came the immensely prosperous Low Countries, the commercial heart of Northern Europe. From his mother Joanna and his grandparents Ferdinand and Isabella came the United Kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, Spain's territories in southern Italy, and a rapidly expanding overseas empire stretching across the Atlantic. 4 dynasties, 4 extraordinary inheritances, all converging through 2 generations of meticulously arranged marriages. No European ruler had ever stood on the verge of inheriting so much. The patient strategy begun by Frederick III, refined by Maximilian, and strengthened through decades of carefully planned alliances, had achieved its greatest triumph. The young heir who stood at the center of it all was named Charles, and with him, the House of Habsburg would reach the very height of its power. He was born in the Low Countries in the year 1500, raised amid the refined courts of Burgundy, and spoke French as his first language. Spain was unfamiliar to him. Austria was even more distant. Few could have imagined that this foreign-born prince would soon become the most powerful ruler in Europe, or that the empire assembled through generations of Habsburg marriages would finally reach its greatest extent in his hands. By the time Charles was still in his late teens, he had inherited more territory than any European monarch since the emperors of ancient Rome. The transformation began in 1516. When his grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon died, Charles inherited the crowns of Castile and Aragon, becoming King of Spain while ruling jointly in the name of his mother, Joanna, who remained confined and officially queen in title. Along with Spain came its growing possessions in southern Italy, Sicily, and an expanding overseas empire that stretched across the Atlantic. Yet the Spanish greeted their new king with deep suspicion. Charles barely spoke their language. He had been raised among Burgundian nobles, arrived surrounded by Flemish advisors, and immediately appointed many of them to positions of influence. To many Spaniards, it seemed that foreigners had come to exploit their kingdom. The resentment soon erupted into open rebellion. The powerful cities of Castile formed what became known as the Revolt of the Comuneros, challenging the young king's authority and demanding greater control over their own affairs. For a moment, Charles's newly acquired kingdom seemed in danger of slipping away almost as quickly as it had fallen into his hands. But the revolt was crushed. The victory secured Charles's position in Spain and gave him a stable foundation for far greater ambitions. 3 years later, destiny intervened once again. In 1519, his grandfather Maximilian I died. Charles immediately entered the contest for the imperial crown, competing against one of the most formidable rulers in Europe, King Francis I of France. The election was never simply a matter of prestige. Whoever became Holy Roman Emperor would stand at the center of European politics, commanding enormous influence across the continent. Winning required more than noble birth. It required money, an astonishing amount of it. Charles borrowed immense sums from the powerful Fugger banking family of Augsburg, using their financial backing to secure the support of the prince-electors. Gifts, loans, and political promises flowed freely as both candidates fought for every vote. In the end, Charles prevailed. At just 19 years old, he became Holy Roman Emperor. The inheritance painstakingly assembled through generations of Habsburg marriages was finally united beneath a single ruler. Its sheer scale was almost impossible to comprehend. His authority stretched from the prosperous cities of the Netherlands through the German lands to Austria. It extended across Spain, into Naples, Sicily, and other Italian possessions. Then crossed the Atlantic to vast territories in the Americas, where the conquests of Mexico and Peru would soon pour unimaginable quantities of silver into the royal treasury. Spanish explorers even established the first footholds across the Pacific, connecting Europe to an empire unlike anything the world had previously seen. It became the first empire of the modern age upon which the sun truly never set. Long before those words were associated with Britain, they described the astonishing reach of Charles V. Yet this unprecedented inheritance brought equally unprecedented burdens. Charles did not govern a single unified state. He ruled a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and cities, each fiercely protective of its own laws, customs, privileges, and political traditions. A king in Spain could not simply rule as he pleased in Germany. Decisions accepted in the Netherlands might provoke outrage in Italy. Every region demanded its own negotiations, ceremonies, and compromises. As a result, Charles spent much of his life traveling. He crossed Europe repeatedly, moving from one realm to another in an endless effort to hold together an empire that had never truly been designed to function as one. And everywhere he turned, another enemy awaited him. France felt increasingly trapped by Habsburg territory surrounding it from almost every direction. To the south lay Spain. To the east stood the empire. To the north were the wealthy Netherlands. King Francis I viewed Charles's growing power as an existential threat, and decades of bitter conflict followed. During the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Charles achieved one of the greatest military victories of his reign. Against all expectations, the French king himself was captured on the battlefield and carried away as a prisoner. It was an astonishing humiliation for France and a spectacular triumph for the Habsburg emperor. Yet victory often carried unintended consequences. Only 2 years later, in 1527, unpaid imperial soldiers mutinied while campaigning in Italy. Marching on Rome without authorization, they stormed the Eternal City in one of the most infamous episodes of the Renaissance. Churches, palaces, and homes were plundered, thousands were killed, and Pope Clement VII was forced to flee. The sack of Rome shocked Christian Europe. Ironically, it had been carried out by the army of the continent's most powerful Catholic ruler. As if war against France were not enough, an even greater threat loomed in the east. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, stood at the height of its power. Ottoman armies swept into Hungary, shattered Christian resistance at the Battle of Mohacs, and twice carried the struggle to the gates of Vienna itself. Charles and his relatives found themselves engaged in a relentless struggle to defend Central Europe, while simultaneously fighting wars in Italy, Germany, and the Mediterranean. The silver flowing from the Americas seemed endless. Even so, it disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Wars consumed fortunes. Empires were expensive. And Charles was fighting on almost every frontier at once. Yet none of these conflicts would trouble him as deeply as the one unfolding within his own empire. In 1517, an obscure Augustinian monk named Martin Luther challenged the authority and practices of the Catholic Church, setting in motion what became the Protestant Reformation. At first, Charles believed the movement could be contained. In 1521, he summoned Luther before the imperial assembly known as the Diet of Worms, expecting him to withdraw his writings. Luther refused. Charles declared him an outlaw and pledged himself to defending the Catholic faith. But ideas cannot always be defeated by armies. Luther's teachings spread rapidly across the German lands. Many princes embraced Protestantism out of genuine religious conviction, while others saw an opportunity to weaken both the church and imperial authority by seizing church lands and asserting greater independence. Eventually, these Protestant rulers united in armed resistance. Charles defeated them decisively at the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, seemingly restoring imperial authority. Yet even victory could not solve the deeper problem. Faith could not be imposed by force. After decades of exhausting conflict, Charles reluctantly accepted the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, allowing each prince within the empire to determine the religion of his own territory. It marked the end of the medieval dream of a single, united Christian Europe. The emperor had won countless battles, but he had failed to preserve religious unity. After decades of war, endless journeys, political crises, and crushing responsibility, the strain finally overwhelmed him. Charles suffered agonizing attacks of gout that left him barely able to walk. The ruler who had inherited half of Europe grew increasingly weary, disappointed, and convinced that even an empire of such immense size could not be held together forever. Then he did something almost unimaginable. At the height of his prestige, while still alive, he voluntarily surrendered his crowns. Between 1555 and 1556, in a series of solemn abdications, Charles gradually handed over his vast inheritance. He withdrew to the monastery of Yusta in western Spain, where he devoted his remaining years to prayer, reflection, and a famously obsessive fascination with mechanical clocks, perhaps searching for order after spending a lifetime trying to govern a world that refused to remain orderly. But Charles's final political decision proved almost as significant as all his victories. Rather than leaving the entire inheritance to a single successor, he divided it. The Spanish kingdoms, the Netherlands, and the overseas empire passed to his son Philip. The Austrian lands and the imperial crown went to his brother Ferdinand. From that moment onward, the House of Habsburg would exist as two great dynasties, one Spanish, one Austrian. Their destinies would remain intertwined, but from this point forward, they would follow very different paths. Although Ferdinand inherited the smaller share of Charles's empire, his lands were no less important. At first glance, they seemed modest compared to Spain's global empire. In reality, they formed the very heart of Habsburg power. Ferdinand received the Austrian hereditary territories, along with two of Central Europe's oldest and most strategically important kingdoms, Bohemia and Hungary. Their acquisition was yet another masterpiece of Habsburg dynastic politics. Years earlier, Maximilian's carefully arranged marriages had tied his family to the ruling house of Hungary and Bohemia. Then, in 1526, everything changed. At the Battle of Mohacs, the young King Louis II was killed fighting the Ottoman Turks without leaving an heir. Because Louis's sister was married to Ferdinand, the Habsburgs possessed a legitimate claim to both crowns. Once again, a marriage had accomplished what generations of warfare might never have achieved. From that moment onward, the House of Habsburg existed as two great dynasties, one Spanish, one Austrian, separate in administration, yet united by blood, shared interests, and common enemies. For generations, the two branches worked closely together. They fought each other's wars, coordinated their diplomacy, and, above all, strengthened their alliance through the strategy that had made the family great in the first place: marriage. Again and again, Spanish Habsburgs married Austrian Habsburgs. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles married nieces. Close relatives became husbands and wives with remarkable frequency. To the dynasty, it made perfect sense. Every marriage kept wealth, titles, and power safely within the family. It prevented rival houses from gaining control of Habsburg lands and reinforced the bond between the Spanish and Austrian branches. For a time, the strategy seemed brilliantly successful. But beneath the glittering royal weddings, an invisible danger was growing. With every generation, the Habsburg bloodline became narrower. The warning signs appeared slowly, so slowly that almost no one recognized them. Yet the very strategy that had built Europe's greatest dynasty was quietly planting the seeds of its destruction. Before we witness that remarkable collapse, however, we must first follow the Spanish Habsburgs to the absolute height of their power. Only then can we understand how an empire that seemed destined to rule the world slowly began to unravel. That moment belonged to Philip II. When Philip inherited the Spanish crown, he became ruler of what was arguably the most powerful monarchy on earth. Yet in temperament, he could hardly have been more different from his father. Charles V had spent his life constantly in motion, crossing mountains, seas, and frontiers in an endless attempt to hold together his sprawling empire. Philip preferred not to travel at all. He governed the world from a desk. Hour after hour, day after day, he buried himself beneath mountains of reports, letters, and royal decrees, reading them personally, covering the margins with his own notes, and signing an astonishing quantity of paperwork by hand. Decisions affecting kingdoms thousands of miles away often passed through his fingers before reaching governors, generals, and viceroys. His empire stretched across continents. His method of ruling rarely required him to leave his chair. To admirers, he became known as the prudent king, a monarch of extraordinary diligence and discipline. To his critics, he resembled a spider sitting patiently at the center of a vast web of paper, controlling distant lands through ink, patience, and relentless attention to detail. The heart of that web stood just outside Madrid. There, Philip built one of the most extraordinary royal residences in Europe, El Escorial. It was far more than a palace. It served simultaneously as a royal residence, a monastery, a basilica, a library, an administrative headquarters, and eventually the burial place of generations of Spanish kings. Its design revealed as much about Philip's character as any document ever could. The enormous complex was deliberately laid out in the shape of a gridiron, the iron grate traditionally associated with the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, who, according to Christian tradition, was executed by being burned alive upon one. Philip chose that design intentionally. The administrative heart of the greatest empire on earth was built to resemble an instrument of martyrdom. It was an unmistakable expression of the king's intense religious devotion, austere personality, and belief that monarchy itself was a sacred duty entrusted to him by God. Under Philip, Spain reached the pinnacle of its political influence. To understand that achievement, however, we must look beyond the royal court and examine the society over which the Habsburgs ruled. Spanish society resembled a towering pyramid. At its summit stood the grandees, the highest rank of aristocracy. These immensely wealthy noble families controlled enormous landed estates and enjoyed privileges unavailable to almost anyone else. Their influence extended through the royal court, the military, and the administration of the empire. Their appearance reflected the values they wished to project. Across Europe, the Spanish court became famous for its severe elegance. Black became the color of authority, dignity, and power. Rich velvet and silk garments, carefully stiffened with starch, were paired with brilliant white ruffs that framed the face with almost architectural precision. Noblewomen wore elaborate hooped skirts that transformed clothing into statements of rank and ceremony. Their dining tables displayed the wealth of a global empire: sugar from overseas plantations, spices carried from Asia, chocolate newly introduced from the Americas, fine wines, rare meats. Behind the luxury, however, lay a rigid code of etiquette and personal honor that governed every aspect of aristocratic life. Beneath the grandees stood the lesser nobility, followed by the rapidly expanding ranks of the clergy. The Catholic Church owned enormous estates and exercised immense political influence. For younger sons with little hope of inheriting family property, an ecclesiastical career offered one of the few realistic paths to wealth, education, and advancement. Below them came the merchants, craftsmen, and artisans of Spain's growing cities. Atlantic commerce brought increasing prosperity through trade in wool, manufactured goods, and the immense flow of American silver. Yet, despite their growing fortunes, successful merchants rarely enjoyed the same respect as ancient noble families. To much of the aristocracy, commerce remained an occupation beneath the dignity of a true gentleman. At the bottom of the social order lived the overwhelming majority of the population, the peasants. They cultivated the fields, harvested the crops, and sustained the empire through exhausting labor. Their meals were simple: bread, beans, chickpeas, onions, occasional cheese, rough wine, and whatever else the land could provide. Their clothing was coarse wool. Their lives followed the rhythms of agriculture, interrupted only by religious festivals, saints' days, and great church processions that marked the passing of the year. Above every level of society, wealth flowed steadily upward. Taxes climbed toward the crown. Silver crossed the Atlantic aboard heavily guarded treasure fleets arriving from the mines of Mexico and Peru. It seemed as though Spain possessed limitless riches. In reality, it never had enough. The empire consumed money almost as quickly as it produced it. Military campaigns, naval construction, diplomacy, and administration demanded staggering sums, forcing the Spanish crown into repeated bankruptcies despite controlling the richest silver mines in the world. Philip believed that this wealth existed for a purpose. He saw himself as the defender of Catholic Europe. Wherever the Catholic faith appeared threatened, Philip considered it his duty to intervene. His greatest military triumph came in 1571 at the Battle of Lepanto, where the combined fleets of the Holy League inflicted a decisive defeat upon the Ottoman navy, ending its dominance in the Western Mediterranean and marking one of the defining naval victories of the 16th century. Soon afterward, fortune smiled upon him once again. When the Portuguese royal line failed, Philip asserted his dynastic claim and secured the Portuguese crown. For the first and only time in history, nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula, together with both the Spanish and Portuguese overseas empires, came under the rule of a single monarch. It was the closest any European ruler had yet come to governing a truly global empire. Yet even as wars multiplied and royal finances deteriorated, Spain experienced an extraordinary cultural flowering. Historians would later call it the Spanish Golden Age. This was the era that produced Miguel de Cervantes, whose tale of an aging knight charging at windmills, Don Quixote, is often regarded as the world's first modern novel. It was the age of brilliant playwrights who packed Madrid's theaters night after night. The age of magnificent painters whose masterpieces would define Spanish art for centuries. Within the royal palaces, artists captured the Habsburg family itself in haunting portraits. Solemn kings, richly dressed queens, and serious-faced royal children whose expressions seemed to hint at the immense burdens carried by the dynasty. It was a remarkable contradiction. The empire's cultural brilliance reached its greatest height precisely as its political and financial foundations were beginning to weaken. That strange combination of splendor and decay would become one of the defining themes of Habsburg history. The first serious cracks appeared in the Low Countries. The wealthy provinces Maximilian had gained through marriage nearly a century earlier increasingly resisted Spanish taxation, centralized rule, and Philip's uncompromising enforcement of Catholic orthodoxy. Led by William of Orange, the rebellion gradually evolved into the 80 Years' War. What began as resistance eventually created something entirely new: an independent Dutch republic. Small in size, fiercely Protestant, commercially innovative, and destined to become one of the world's great naval and trading powers. Then came Philip's greatest gamble. In 1588, determined to overthrow Protestant England, end English support for the Dutch rebels, and halt attacks on Spanish treasure fleets, he launched the largest naval expedition Europe had ever seen: the Spanish Armada. The plan promised a decisive victory. Instead, it became one of history's greatest military disasters. English ships repeatedly disrupted the Spanish formation, while powerful Atlantic storms scattered the surviving fleet as it attempted to sail around Scotland and Ireland. Hundreds of ships never returned. Thousands of sailors perished. The defeat damaged not only Spain's navy, but something far harder to rebuild: its aura of invincibility. When Philip II died in 1598, Spain remained Europe's greatest power, but the summit had already been reached. The empire was locked into expensive wars on multiple fronts. Its economy was buckling beneath impossible financial demands. American silver could no longer keep pace with imperial ambition. And beneath all those mounting pressures lay another danger, one created not by foreign enemies, but by the Habsburgs themselves. The dynasty that had conquered Europe through marriage was about to discover the hidden cost of keeping that bloodline too pure. The empire Philip II left behind remained immense, but it no longer produced rulers equal to the task of governing it. The kings who followed him lacked his relentless discipline and tireless attention to detail. Increasingly, they entrusted the day-to-day running of the monarchy to powerful royal favorites, chief ministers known in Spain as validos, who exercised authority in the king's name, while the monarch devoted himself to hunting, religious observance, or the ceremonies of court. Some of these ministers were capable. Others were disastrously incompetent. Under their direction, the Spanish monarchy drifted from one crisis to the next. One of the most damaging decisions came in the early 17th century, when the crown ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos, the descendants of Spain's Muslim population who had converted to Christianity. Hundreds of thousands of skilled farmers, craftsmen, and laborers were forced from the kingdom. Entire regions lost experienced agricultural workers and artisans, weakening an economy that was already struggling under the immense cost of empire. At the same time, Spain remained trapped in seemingly endless wars. Its armies fought in the German lands during the 30 Years' War. They battled the Dutch, who continued their long struggle for independence. They confronted France, whose growing power challenged Spanish dominance across Europe. Every victory demanded more money. Every defeat demanded even more. Then came the breaking point. In the 1640s, multiple rebellions erupted almost simultaneously. Catalonia rose against Madrid. Portugal also revolted, rejecting 60 years of Habsburg rule. This time, Spain could not restore the old order. Portugal regained its independence permanently. With it went the Portuguese overseas empire, stretching from Brazil to Africa and Asia. The empire that had once united almost the entire Iberian world had begun to come apart. Yet even these military defeats were not the dynasty's greatest danger. The most serious threat had been growing quietly within the royal family itself for generations. The Habsburgs had always believed that marriages were the key to preserving power. Now they carried that principle to its extreme. Determined to prevent their crowns and territories from passing into rival dynasties, they repeatedly arranged marriages between their own closest relatives. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. Spanish Habsburgs married Austrian Habsburgs. Their children then married back into the same family again. Generation after generation, the royal bloodline became increasingly isolated from the rest of Europe. Today, we understand the biological consequences of that strategy. Close relatives are far more likely to carry the same harmful genetic variants inherited from common ancestors. When such relatives have children together repeatedly across many generations, the chances of those hidden traits appearing increase dramatically. That is precisely what happened to the Spanish Habsburgs. Perhaps the most recognizable consequence became famous throughout Europe. Again and again, court portraits reveal members of the dynasty with the same unusually protruding lower jaw and enlarged lower lip. The feature became so strongly associated with the family that history remembers it simply as the Habsburg jaw. But the visible appearance was only part of the problem. The accumulated effects reached far deeper. The final Spanish Habsburg was Charles II. Born in 1661, after generations of repeated intermarriage, Charles entered the world carrying an extraordinary genetic burden. His life was profoundly tragic. He was physically weak from childhood, plagued by chronic illness, and developed far more slowly than other children. His jaw was so severely deformed that eating became difficult, and speaking was often hard to understand. Throughout his life, he suffered repeated illnesses, infertility, and severe physical limitations. Many of his contemporaries concluded that no natural explanation could account for his condition. They believed he had been cursed, or bewitched. The nickname remained with him for the rest of his life, Charles the Bewitched. Modern genetic research paints a different picture. By reconstructing the Habsburg family tree and calculating the degree of relatedness between generations, researchers have concluded that Charles II possessed one of the highest documented levels of inbreeding ever identified among European royal families. His many physical disabilities and inability to father an heir were almost certainly consequences of that accumulated genetic inheritance. When Charles II died in 1700, he left behind no children. With him, the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg came to an end. More than 2 centuries of dynastic ambition had produced a family so determined to preserve its own bloodline that it ultimately extinguished itself. But Charles left behind something almost as dangerous as an heir. He left behind a disputed will. Immediately, Europe faced an enormous question. Who should inherit the vast Spanish Empire? The answer mattered to every major power on the continent. If the Austrian Habsburgs recovered Spain, they might recreate the enormous empire once ruled by Charles V. If the French Bourbons inherited everything instead, France would become overwhelmingly powerful. Neither possibility was acceptable to the rest of Europe. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession. For more than a decade, armies marched across the continent in one of the largest conflicts Europe had yet experienced. Great victories won by commanders such as John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, alongside the brilliant Austrian general Prince Eugene of Savoy, shattered French armies and transformed the balance of power. When peace finally came, Europe accepted a compromise. The Spanish crown passed to a Bourbon prince from the French royal family. But one condition was absolute. The crowns of France and Spain could never be united upon the same head. The balance of power had been preserved. The Spanish Habsburgs had not. The dynasty that had once seemed destined to rule the world had destroyed one of its own greatest branches through the very marriage strategy that had made it powerful. Yet the House of Habsburg itself had not fallen. One branch was gone. The other remained. With Spain lost forever, the future of the dynasty now rested entirely where it had first truly risen centuries earlier, back in Vienna. Before we continue with the Austrian Habsburgs, we need to step back in time. While the Spanish branch was slowly drifting toward its tragic end, the Austrian branch had already endured one of the greatest disasters in European history. It was a conflict so destructive that it scarred the heart of the continent for generations. And remarkably, it began with 3 men being thrown out of a window. By the early 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire remained a fragile patchwork of Catholic and Protestant states. The religious compromise that Charles V had reluctantly accepted had never truly resolved the tensions beneath the surface. Every dispute over political authority carried the risk of becoming a religious conflict, and every religious disagreement threatened to become a political crisis. The Habsburg emperors saw themselves as the defenders of Catholic Europe. Many Protestant nobles believed the emperors were steadily stripping away the rights and freedoms they had fought to preserve. The collision finally came in Prague. In 1618, Protestant nobles from the Kingdom of Bohemia marched into Prague Castle to confront representatives of their Habsburg ruler. Tempers flared. Accusations flew across the chamber. Then, in a sudden explosion of fury, the nobles seized two royal governors and their secretary, dragged them to an open window, and hurled all three from the upper floor of the castle. The drop measured more than 20 meters. Remarkably, all three men survived. Catholic writers later claimed angels had carried them safely to the ground. Protestant observers offered a far less miraculous explanation, insisting they had simply landed in a large pile of manure below the castle walls. Whatever broke their fall, the political consequences were unmistakable. The defenestration of Prague was far more than an act of violence. It was a declaration of open rebellion, and it lit the fuse beneath one of history's most devastating wars. The Bohemian rebels rejected their Habsburg king and offered the crown to the Protestant Elector Palatine, Frederick V. The new Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, regarded the rebellion not merely as political treason, but as a direct challenge to both his authority and the Catholic faith. His response was swift and uncompromising. In 1620, the opposing armies met just outside Prague at the Battle of White Mountain. The fighting lasted barely an hour. The Bohemian revolt collapsed with astonishing speed. Its consequences were severe. Leading Protestant nobles were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their estates were confiscated and redistributed to loyal Catholic supporters. Thousands of Protestant families fled into exile, while the Habsburg government launched an intensive campaign to restore Catholicism throughout Bohemia. The rebellion had been crushed, but the war was only beginning. Like a widening fire, the conflict drew in one European power after another. First came Denmark. King Christian IV entered the struggle hoping to defend the Protestant cause and expand Danish influence within northern Germany. He was defeated. Then emerged one of the war's most extraordinary figures, Albrecht von Wallenstein. A brilliant, immensely wealthy nobleman, Wallenstein raised enormous private armies that largely sustained themselves by requisitioning supplies from the territories through which they marched. His campaigns brought spectacular victories for the emperor, but his growing independence also inspired deep suspicion at court. Eventually, Ferdinand II concluded that his own greatest general had become too powerful. In 1634, Wallenstein was assassinated by officers loyal to the emperor he had served. Yet even that did not end the conflict. Soon, another formidable commander entered the war, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. Gifted, innovative, and remarkably aggressive, the Swedish king transformed Protestant fortunes through a series of stunning victories that revolutionized European warfare. His disciplined armies swept deep into Germany, forcing the Habsburgs onto the defensive. But victory came at a terrible cost. At the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, Gustavus Adolphus was killed while leading his troops through the smoke and confusion of battle. Even the death of one of Europe's greatest military commanders failed to bring peace. The war had become something larger than religion alone. Its final transformation came when Catholic France entered the conflict. At first glance, the decision seemed almost unbelievable. A Catholic kingdom had joined forces with Protestant states against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. But France's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, understood that power mattered more than doctrine. The Habsburgs surrounded France from Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, northern Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire itself. Breaking that encirclement became France's overriding objective. Political survival outweighed religious solidarity. By then, the war had consumed Central Europe. For 30 relentless years, armies marched back and forth across the German lands, living off whatever they could seize. Villages were burned, Harvests were destroyed. Cities were looted repeatedly. Famine followed the soldiers, while plague spread through populations already weakened by hunger and displacement. Entire regions were left desolate. In some parts of the empire, more than a third of the population disappeared through warfare, starvation, or disease. Few conflicts before the 20th century inflicted destruction on such a scale. Only the world wars would bring comparable devastation to Central Europe. Finally, in 1648, exhaustion accomplished what no army had been able to achieve. The Peace of Westphalia ended the conflict. Its consequences permanently transformed Europe. The German princes gained broad authority to determine the religion and internal government of their own territories. The Holy Roman Empire survived, but it emerged weaker than ever, a loose federation of hundreds of largely autonomous states rather than a unified political power. The emperor still wore the imperial crown, but much of the authority that crown had once symbolized had slipped away forever. The medieval dream of a single Christian empire, united beneath Habsburg leadership, had finally come to an end. Yet the Austrian Habsburgs learned an invaluable lesson from the catastrophe. If the empire could no longer serve as the true foundation of their power, something else would have to. From this point onward, they increasingly focused on strengthening the lands they actually controlled: Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. Those hereditary kingdoms, not the fading prestige of the imperial title, would become the foundation upon which the Austrian Habsburgs rebuilt their strength. And before long, they would face a challenge even greater than the 30 Years' War. The armies of the Ottoman Empire were marching toward Vienna. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. At its height, it stretched across 3 continents, ruling lands in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Long before the 30 Years' War devastated Germany, Ottoman armies had been steadily advancing into southeastern Europe, swallowing one Christian kingdom after another. It was the Ottomans who had shattered the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, killing the young King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia as he fled the battlefield. His death without an heir had triggered the dynastic marriages arranged decades earlier by Maximilian I, allowing the Habsburgs to claim both crowns. The family's rise in Central Europe had come, in no small part, through an Ottoman victory. Nor was this their first encounter with Vienna. In 1529, under the legendary Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman armies had already reached the Habsburg capital. Only determined resistance, dreadful weather, and the arrival of winter forced them to withdraw before the city could be taken. More than 150 years later, they returned. This time, they intended to finish the job. By 1683, the Ottoman Empire had regained much of its strength under the energetic leadership of the Köprülü Grand Viziers. Confident once again, the empire launched one final massive offensive into Central Europe. Leading the campaign was the ambitious Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. His objective was unmistakable: Vienna. If the Habsburg capital fell, the road into the German lands beyond would lie open. Few doubted that the balance of power across Europe could change forever. An enormous Ottoman army marched up the Danube. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, but it was undoubtedly one of the largest forces ever assembled by the empire for a European campaign. Facing such overwhelming numbers, Emperor Leopold I made the painful decision to abandon the capital. Careful, deeply religious, and rarely inclined toward reckless risks, Leopold evacuated his court and government, preserving the dynasty in case the city itself was lost. Behind Vienna's walls remained only a relatively small garrison, supported by thousands of ordinary citizens who suddenly found themselves responsible for defending the heart of the Habsburg monarchy. Then the siege began. For nearly 2 relentless months, Vienna endured constant bombardment. The Ottoman engineers were among the finest in the world. Rather than relying solely on artillery, they dug an elaborate network of tunnels beneath the city's fortifications, packing them with barrels of gunpowder in hopes of blowing enormous breaches through the walls. The defenders answered tunnel with tunnel. Working underground in darkness, they desperately searched for Ottoman mines, sometimes fighting brutal hand-to-hand battles beneath the earth itself before explosions buried entire passages. Above ground, the situation became increasingly desperate. Food dwindled, disease spread through the crowded city, gunpowder ran low. Every successful assault left the walls weaker than before. By early September, sections of Vienna's defenses were beginning to collapse. The exhausted garrison understood a terrible truth. They were running out of time. Had the city fallen, there would have been little standing between the Ottoman army and the heart of Central Europe. Salvation arrived at the very last moment. Across the hills overlooking Vienna, a great relief army finally assembled: imperial troops, German contingents, and, most importantly, a powerful Polish force led personally by King Jan III Sobieski. Answering desperate appeals from the Emperor and the Pope, Sobieski marched to Vienna in what many contemporaries regarded as a final effort to save Christian Europe. On the morning of September 12, 1683, the Allied army descended from the wooded heights overlooking the city and crashed into the Ottoman siege lines. The battle reached its unforgettable climax late that afternoon. Thousands of cavalry thundered downhill together. Among them rode the legendary Polish winged hussars, their great feathered frames rising behind their backs as they charged. It became one of the largest cavalry assaults in military history. The exhausted Ottoman army finally broke. After months of siege, the tide turned in a single afternoon. Vienna had been saved. Kara Mustafa fled the battlefield. His failure carried the ultimate price. By order of the Sultan himself, the Grand Vizier was executed only months later, strangled with a silk cord in accordance with Ottoman custom for high-ranking officials. The victory at Vienna marked far more than the lifting of a siege. It marked the turning point in centuries of conflict. From that moment onward, the Ottoman Empire increasingly fought on the defensive in Central Europe. The Habsburgs, for the first time in generations, carried the war into Ottoman territory. At the center of that transformation stood one remarkable commander, Prince Eugene of Savoy. Brilliant, fearless, and relentlessly aggressive, Eugene repeatedly defeated Ottoman armies in a succession of campaigns that permanently shifted the balance of power. His victories recovered almost all of Hungary for the Habsburg monarchy and pushed the Ottoman frontier hundreds of kilometers to the southeast. The dynasty that had nearly lost its capital emerged stronger than ever before. Austria was no longer simply defending Europe. It had become one of Europe's dominant military powers. Victory reshaped Vienna itself. For centuries, the city had lived as a frontier fortress, constantly preparing for another Ottoman invasion. Now, with the frontier pushed far away, fear gave way to confidence. The emperors began transforming Vienna into one of the grandest capitals on the continent. Magnificent Baroque architecture rose across the city. Its sweeping curves, towering domes, rich ornamentation, and golden interiors proclaimed not merely wealth, but triumph. Prince Eugene built the elegant Belvedere Palace, one of Europe's architectural masterpieces. The Habsburg emperors expanded Schönbrunn Palace into a magnificent imperial residence designed to rival the splendor of Versailles itself. Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach reshaped the skyline with masterpieces such as the Karlskirche, whose soaring dome and monumental columns announced both imperial confidence and Catholic victory. Stone itself became propaganda. Every palace, church, and avenue proclaimed that Vienna was now the unquestioned capital of a great European power. the victories did not end there. When the War of the Spanish Succession finally concluded, the Austrian Habsburgs inherited many of Spain's former European possessions, including the Spanish Netherlands and valuable territories in northern and southern Italy. From Vienna, they now ruled an empire stretching from the Low Countries to Naples. The dynasty had survived. It had adapted. And once again, it had emerged stronger than anyone expected. One delightful legend has become forever attached to the Great Siege. According to the story, Vienna's bakers, working through the night, were the first to hear Ottoman engineers tunneling beneath the walls. They sounded the alarm, helping save the city from surprise attack. To celebrate the victory, they supposedly baked a pastry shaped like the Ottoman crescent moon so that the people of Vienna could symbolically devour their defeated enemy at breakfast. That pastry, the story claims, became the croissant. The tale is charming. Modern historians are highly skeptical that it is true. But like so many great legends, it has proved almost impossible to kill. The Ottoman threat had finally receded. The Austrian Habsburg monarchy stood at the height of its confidence. Yet the greatest challenge the dynasty would ever face was no longer marching toward Vienna from abroad. It was about to emerge from within the family itself. By the middle of the 18th century, that challenge had arrived. The emperor faced a problem that no battlefield victory could solve. He had no surviving son. To modern eyes, that might seem like little more than a family tragedy. In 18th century Europe, it threatened the destruction of an entire empire. The Habsburg monarchy was not a single unified kingdom, but a collection of hereditary lands held together by one ruling family. If rival claimants challenged the succession, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the dynasty's other possessions could easily be torn apart by competing princes and ambitious neighboring powers. Charles was determined that would never happen. He devoted years of his reign to securing the future through diplomacy rather than war. His solution became known as the Pragmatic Sanction. The document declared that all Habsburg hereditary lands would remain forever united and could pass intact to his eldest daughter if no son survived. The law itself was only the beginning. For years, Charles persuaded virtually every major European power, along with the assemblies of his own kingdoms and provinces, to recognize the agreement. He paid for that recognition with money, political concessions, and painstaking diplomacy. One by one, Europe's rulers solemnly promised to respect the succession. Then Charles VI died in 1740. And almost overnight, many of those promises proved worthless. His heir was his eldest daughter. She was only 23 years old, recently married, and expecting another child. Despite being raised to embody royal dignity, she had received remarkably little practical training in government because even her own father had struggled to imagine that she would actually have to rule. Europe saw opportunity. Among the first to act was the ambitious young king of Prussia. History would remember him as Frederick the Great. He looked across the frontier, saw a young woman surrounded by uncertainty, and concluded that the Habsburg monarchy was ripe for dismemberment. Without declaring war on any convincing legal grounds, he invaded the rich province of Silesia, one of the wealthiest, most industrialized, and economically valuable territories in the entire Habsburg monarchy. Others quickly followed his example. France, Bavaria, Saxony, Spain. One after another, rival powers moved to seize territory before the Habsburg inheritance could stabilize. What began as a disputed succession rapidly became a struggle for the very survival of the dynasty. It became known as the... Many expected the Habsburg monarchy to collapse. Instead, they discovered they had profoundly underestimated Maria Theresa. She possessed neither great military experience nor years of political training. What she did possess was extraordinary determination. She refused to surrender. she refused to negotiate away her inheritance. And she proved herself one of the most gifted political leaders her family had ever produced. The defining moment came in Hungary. Traveling personally to Pressburg, today's Etror, Maria Theresa appeared before the Hungarian Diet, dressed in mourning, carrying her infant son and appealing directly to the kingdom's fiercely independent nobles. She did not simply ask for soldiers. She appealed to their loyalty, their honor, and their shared history. The scene became legendary. Moved by the spectacle of their young queen standing before them in the kingdom's hour of greatest danger, the assembled nobles reportedly drew their swords and pledged their lives and blood in her defense. Whether every dramatic detail unfolded exactly as later generations remembered hardly matters. The result certainly did. Hungary rallied to her cause. Its soldiers became one of the foundations upon which the Habsburg monarchy survived. Maria Theresa could not recover Silesia. Frederick held on to it despite repeated campaigns, and the loss remained a personal wound she never fully accepted. But she preserved almost everything else. Against overwhelming odds, the dynasty survived. Peace gave her something even more valuable than victory: time to rebuild. Maria Theresa understood that the monarchy had escaped disaster only because of extraordinary determination and extraordinary luck. She intended never to leave its survival to chance again. She reorganized the army from top to bottom. She modernized taxation, forcing even sections of the nobility to contribute more fairly to the costs of government. She streamlined the sprawling bureaucracy. She expanded education throughout her lands and strengthened the central administration in ways that made the monarchy more efficient than it had ever been before. By the end of her reign, the Habsburg state had been transformed. It remained a collection of many peoples and many kingdoms, but it functioned with a level of organization previous generations could scarcely have imagined. She also revolutionized European diplomacy. For more than 2 centuries, the defining rivalry of continental politics had opposed the Habsburgs and France. Guided by her brilliant chancellor, Austria abandoned its long-standing partnership with Britain and forged an alliance with its old enemy, France. Historians remember the astonishing reversal simply as the diplomatic revolution. Its purpose was clear: isolate Prussia and recover Silesia. The new alliance led directly into another enormous conflict. The battles erupted across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. For that reason, many historians describe it as the world's first truly global war. At first, Frederick of Prussia appeared doomed. Surrounded by enemies on every side, defeat seemed inevitable. Yet Frederick combined remarkable military skill with astonishing resilience. Then fortune intervened. In 1762, one of Frederick's fiercest enemies died unexpectedly. Her successor admired Frederick deeply and immediately withdrew Russia from the war. The sudden reversal became famous as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Prussia survived. When peace finally returned, Silesia remained Prussian. Maria Theresa reluctantly accepted that it was lost forever. But something far more important had changed. Prussia had established itself as a permanent great power. From that point onward, 2 German-speaking states stood at the center of European politics: Vienna and Berlin. Their rivalry would dominate Central Europe for more than a century. Maria Theresa's achievements become even more remarkable when viewed alongside her private life. During her reign, she gave birth to 16 children. While governing one of Europe's largest monarchies, she was simultaneously raising one of Europe's largest royal families. Like generations of Habsburg rulers before her, she understood that children were also instruments of diplomacy. Their marriages became the threads of a vast political web, stretching across the continent. The most famous of them all was her youngest surviving daughter. Still a teenager, she was sent to France to marry the future king, sealing Austria's new alliance with its former enemy. Years later, during the Eiffurne, she would walk to the guillotine, becoming one of history's most recognizable royal victims. Maria Theresa's own marriage quietly changed the dynasty forever. Unlike many of her ancestors, she had married largely for love. Her husband, became Holy Roman Emperor alongside her. Their descendants officially belonged not to the old House of Habsburg alone, but to the new House of Habsburg-Lorraine. The name changed. The dynasty did not. To Europe and to history, they remained simply the Habsburgs. Maria Theresa's greatest challenge had been preserving the Habsburg monarchy. Her eldest son believed preserving it was not enough. It had to be transformed. Joseph II was unlike almost any ruler his dynasty had ever produced. He came of age during the Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement of the 18th century that celebrated reason, science, education, and the belief that human society could be improved through rational thought rather than inherited custom or unquestioned tradition. Joseph embraced those ideas with remarkable enthusiasm. Where his mother instinctively compromised, Joseph preferred decisive action. Where she moved cautiously, balancing every reform against the interests of the nobility, the church, and the many peoples of her empire, Joseph saw hesitation as weakness. He believed that an enlightened ruler should not merely govern society, he should redesign it. Joseph often described himself as the first servant of the state. To him, the monarch existed not to preserve old privileges, but to create a more rational, efficient, and just society, even if that required sweeping away centuries of established tradition. For years, however, his ambitions remained restrained. After the death of his father, Francis Stephen, Joseph became co-ruler alongside Maria Theresa. It proved an uneasy partnership. Mother and son respected one another deeply. They also argued constantly. Maria Theresa's deep Catholic faith shaped every political decision she made. Joseph's confidence rested instead in reason and reform. She feared moving too quickly. He believed she never moved quickly enough. Time after time, she moderated or blocked his most ambitious proposals. Joseph grew increasingly frustrated. Only after Maria Theresa died in 1780 did he finally possess the unrestricted authority he had long desired. He wasted no time. What followed was one of the most ambitious reform programs ever attempted by a European monarch. Joseph attacked almost every corner of society simultaneously. He abolished serfdom, freeing millions of peasants from many of the legal obligations that had bound them to their landlords for generations. He issued sweeping edicts of toleration, granting Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews freedoms that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. He reduced censorship. He reorganized the courts. He simplified the legal system and restricted many of the harshest criminal punishments. Then he turned his attention toward one of the most powerful institutions in the monarchy, the Catholic Church. Joseph admired religion. He had far less respect for what he regarded as unnecessary religious institutions. Hundreds of monasteries and convents devoted primarily to contemplation rather than education, medicine, or charitable work were dissolved by imperial decree. Their wealth was confiscated. Their lands were sold. The proceeds funded schools, hospitals, and new parish churches that Joseph believed served society far more effectively. Even the education of priests increasingly came under state supervision rather than direct papal control. To Joseph, the church existed to benefit the state, not the other way around. His reforms reached still further. Seeking greater administrative efficiency, he attempted to make German the common language of government throughout his extraordinarily diverse empire. From Austria to Hungary, from Bohemia to the Austrian Netherlands, officials were increasingly expected to conduct administration in a single language under a more centralized bureaucracy. On paper, the logic was compelling. A government speaking one administrative language could govern more efficiently than dozens of competing systems. In practice, the policy touched something far more powerful than efficiency: identity. Many of the peoples within the monarchy saw the reforms not as modernization, but as an assault upon their own history, traditions, and local autonomy. Resistance spread almost everywhere. The nobility fiercely opposed the erosion of their ancient privileges. The church condemned the emperor's interference in religious affairs. Hungarian nobles rejected efforts to weaken their historic rights. The Austrian Netherlands erupted in open rebellion. Even many ordinary people, who might have benefited from Joseph's reforms, struggled to accept changes imposed so rapidly from above. Joseph had attempted to modernize an empire. Instead, he found himself battling much of it. By the final years of his reign, the crisis had become overwhelming. The Austrian Netherlands openly declared independence. Hungary edged dangerously close to revolt. Across the monarchy, resistance multiplied faster than reform. The emperor, who had dreamed of building the most enlightened state in Europe, watched his life's work begin to unravel before his eyes. Broken in health and deeply disappointed, Joseph II died in 1790. According to a famous tradition, he drafted the inscription for his own tomb. It declared that here lay a ruler who, despite possessing the best of intentions, had failed in everything he had undertaken. The epitaph was almost certainly too harsh. Joseph did not fail in everything. His successors quietly abandoned many of his boldest and most controversial reforms in order to restore stability. His younger brother, Leopold II, spent much of his brief reign calming the political storms Joseph had created. Yet some of Joseph's achievements proved impossible to erase. The weakening of serfdom, greater religious toleration, a more professional and centralized administration, the belief that government existed to improve society rather than merely preserve privilege. These ideas survived long after the emperor himself was gone. Joseph II remains one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. He was a visionary whose ideas were often decades ahead of his time. He was also a reformer who discovered that even the wisest ideas can fail if they are imposed faster than people are willing to accept them. And as Joseph's experiment came to its troubled end, events were already unfolding across the border in France that would shake every royal dynasty in Europe, including the Habsburgs, to their very foundations. As the 18th century drew to its dramatic close, a force erupted from France that would shake every throne in Europe to its foundations. No dynasty felt the shock more directly than the Habsburgs. What began in 1789 as a political crisis soon became a revolution unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. The old monarchy collapsed. King Louis XVI was sent to the guillotine. Months later, his queen followed him. She was Marie Antoinette, the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa, once dispatched to France as the living symbol of an alliance between two great royal houses. Now she died before a cheering revolutionary crowd. The marriage that had been meant to secure peace ended beneath the blade of the guillotine. But the revolution did not stop with France. Its leaders declared war on the old monarchies of Europe, determined not merely to defend the new republic, but to spread revolutionary ideas across the continent. Coalition after coalition marched against France. Coalition after coalition failed, and from the chaos emerged one of history's greatest military commanders, Napoleon Bonaparte. Within only a few years, the young Corsican officer had transformed revolutionary France into the dominant military power in Europe. For the Habsburgs, his rise became a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Again and again, Austrian armies marched into battle. Again and again, Napoleon defeated them. The reigning Habsburg ruler, Francis II, watched as provinces were occupied, armies destroyed, treasuries emptied, and generations of carefully balanced European diplomacy collapsed beneath the speed and brilliance of French conquest. The greatest humiliation came in 1805. Near the Moravian town of Austerlitz, deep within Habsburg territory, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia. What followed became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. It is still regarded as one of the greatest masterpieces of military strategy ever fought. Through deception, speed, and flawless timing, Napoleon shattered the Allied army in a single day. The defeat was catastrophic. Austria was forced out of the war. Its prestige lay in ruins. Its influence across Germany weakened more than ever before. Yet Napoleon wanted more than victory. He wanted legitimacy. He intended not merely to defeat Europe's ancient dynasties, but to replace them. Across the German lands, he swept away centuries of political tradition. Ancient principalities disappeared. New kingdoms were created. Old borders vanished almost overnight. Many of the German princes abandoned their loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor and entered Napoleon's new Confederation of the Rhine instead. The empire that had existed for nearly 1,000 years was quietly falling apart. Francis understood exactly what was happening. If Napoleon intended to become a new Charlemagne, then the ancient imperial title itself was in danger. Rather than wait for events to overtake him, Francis acted first. In 1804, while he still wore the crown of Holy Roman Emperor, he proclaimed a new title, Emperor of Austria. For the first time, the Habsburg hereditary lands were formally united into a single Austrian empire with its own independent imperial crown. For 2 remarkable years, Francis carried 2 imperial titles at once. One looked back to the Middle Ages. The other looked towards the future. The older title would not survive. In 1806, following yet another defeat and faced with the collapse of imperial authority across Germany, Francis made a decision almost impossible to imagine. He formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. With a single signature, an institution that traced its origins back almost a millennium, to Charlemagne, to medieval Christendom, and ultimately to the legacy of ancient Rome itself, ceased to exist. The crown the Habsburgs had worn for centuries simply disappeared. The dynasty remained. The empire did not. Francis laid aside the ancient title forever and continued only as Emperor of Austria. Even amid these disasters, the Habsburgs reached once more for the weapon that had served them better than any army: marriage. After another Austrian defeat, both sides sought peace. Napoleon desired something no battlefield could give him: legitimacy. He wanted an heir born into one of Europe's oldest royal families. Francis agreed to provide it. His young daughter, Marie-Louise, married the man who had repeatedly humbled her family on the battlefield. For centuries, the Habsburgs had married their way to power. Now they married into power simply to survive. The union produced a son, but it could not secure Napoleon's future. His ambition eventually outran even his extraordinary genius. The disastrous invasion of Russia destroyed the core of his army. Across Europe, his enemies sensed that the seemingly invincible emperor could finally be beaten. Austria joined the coalition that ultimately defeated him. After years of almost continuous war, Europe's exhausted rulers gathered to rebuild the continent. They met not in Paris, nor in London, but in Vienna. The Habsburg capital had become the diplomatic center of Europe. The leading architect of the settlement was Austria's brilliant foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich. Cool, calculating, and deeply conservative, Metternich believed that revolution itself, not merely Napoleon, was the greatest danger facing Europe. The settlement he helped create became known as the Congress of Vienna. Its goal was not simply to make peace, it was to restore balance, strengthen the old monarchies, and prevent another revolution from overturning the continent. The Habsburgs emerged from the Napoleonic Wars battered, diminished, and forever changed. They had lost the ancient imperial crown that had defined them for centuries. But once again, they had survived the greatest storm of their age. And once again, survival proved to be the dynasty's greatest talent. The conservative order that Prince Metternich had built after Napoleon rested on a simple belief. If revolution could be contained, the old monarchies would endure. For a generation, it seemed he was right. Then the year 1848 arrived. Across Europe, revolution exploded almost simultaneously. In Paris, Berlin, Milan, Prague, Budapest, and Vienna, crowds poured into the streets demanding constitutions, civil liberties, representative government, and above all, the right of nations to govern themselves. Two powerful new ideas were sweeping across the continent: liberalism and nationalism. Together, they posed a challenge unlike any the Habsburgs had ever faced. For centuries, the dynasty had ruled not because its subjects shared one language or one national identity, but because they shared loyalty to one emperor. Now, millions increasingly believed that language, culture, and nationality mattered more than dynastic tradition. No European state was more vulnerable to that idea than the Habsburg monarchy. Its empire stretched across Central Europe like a giant mosaic. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Romanians, Slovaks, Slovens, Italians, Serbs, Ukrainians, and many more. Each possessed its own history, traditions, and growing national consciousness. When revolution arrived, it erupted almost everywhere at once. Vienna itself rose in revolt. Students and workers filled the streets. Barricades appeared. In Hungary, revolution became a full-scale war for independence. The Italian provinces rebelled. Prague erupted. Throughout the monarchy, authority seemed to be collapsing. Even Prince Metternich, the architect of Europe's conservative order, was forced to flee Vienna disguised as an ordinary civilian. The man who had spent decades suppressing revolution escaped one himself. For a moment, it appeared the Habsburg Empire might simply cease to exist. Out of that crisis emerged a new emperor. The aging and increasingly ineffective Ferdinand I was persuaded to abdicate. The crown passed instead to his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph. He would remain on the throne for the next 68 years, long enough to witness both the last great age of the dynasty and its final collapse. Young Franz Joseph possessed none of Napoleon's brilliance or Joseph II's sweeping idealism. Instead, he embodied duty. He rose before dawn almost every morning. He worked relentlessly. He read endless government papers. He answered correspondence personally. He believed that discipline, routine, and tireless labor could hold together an empire that seemed forever on the edge of falling apart. In the short term, they almost did. With decisive assistance from Tsar Nicholas I and the Russian army, Franz Joseph crushed the Hungarian Revolution after a bitter campaign. Rebellions elsewhere were gradually suppressed. Order returned. But the victory solved only the immediate crisis. It solved nothing of the deeper problem. Nationalism had not been defeated. It had merely been postponed. Meanwhile, Austria's position abroad steadily deteriorated. The movement for Italian unification stripped away Lombardy and then Venetia, ending centuries of Habsburg influence across northern Italy. An even greater humiliation followed in 1866. Prussia, under the brilliant leadership of Otto von Bismarck and General Helmuth von Moltke, challenged Austria for supremacy within the German world. The war lasted only a few weeks. Its decisive moment came at the Battle of Königgrätz. There, the Prussian army, equipped with superior organization and modern breech-loading rifles, inflicted a crushing defeat upon Austria. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. For centuries, the Habsburgs had stood at the center of German affairs. Now they were pushed out completely. Prussia would go on to unite Germany without Austria. The dream of Habsburg leadership over the German-speaking world was finished forever. Franz Joseph now ruled not a German empire, but a Central European one. The defeat left him little choice but to compromise with the empire's most powerful dissatisfied nationality: the Hungarians. In 1867, Emperor and Hungarian leaders reached an agreement known simply as the Compromise. It transformed the empire into Austria-Hungary, the dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary became two largely self-governing states, united only by one monarch, one foreign policy, one army, and shared finances. The arrangement stabilized the empire. It also exposed its greatest weakness. If the Hungarians deserved equality, why not the Czechs? Why not the Croats, the Romanians, the Slovaks, the Serbs? The compromise answered one national question, while encouraging every other nationality to demand the same treatment. The empire endured. Its internal tensions only deepened. As political difficulties multiplied, Franz Joseph's personal life became increasingly tragic. The remarkable good fortune that had carried the Habsburgs upward for centuries seemed finally to have deserted them. His younger brother, Maximilian, accepted an extraordinary offer to become Emperor of Mexico under the protection of French troops. The experiment collapsed almost immediately. Abandoned by his allies, Maximilian was captured by Republican forces and executed before a firing squad. Only a few years later came an even greater personal catastrophe. Franz Joseph's only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, died at the hunting lodge of Mayerling alongside his young mistress in what was almost certainly a murder-suicide. The scandal shocked Europe. More importantly, it shattered the line of succession. Then tragedy struck once again. The emperor's beloved wife, Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi, whose beauty became legendary and whose restless spirit often drove her far from the rigid etiquette of the Viennese court, was assassinated in Switzerland by an Italian anarchist wielding nothing more than a sharpened file. The old emperor seemed destined to outlive everyone he loved. Year after year, funeral after funeral, Franz Joseph remained at his desk while the world around him slowly changed beyond recognition. By the beginning of the 20th century, he had become almost a living monument to another age. One final tradition captured the extraordinary character of the dynasty he represented. Beneath the streets of Vienna lies the Imperial Crypt, where more than 150 Habsburgs rest. Yet many emperors were never buried whole. Their bodies were placed in the Imperial Crypt. Their hearts rested separately inside the Augustinian Church. Their embalmed internal organs were interred beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral. Even in death, a single Habsburg ruler could be divided among 3 different sacred places. It was an oddly fitting ritual. For centuries, the dynasty itself had been scattered across countless kingdoms, languages, peoples, and crowns. Now only one final blow remained. One assassination, one wrong turn in a provincial Balkan city, and 6 centuries of Habsburg history would come crashing to an end. History rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes a civilization reaches its greatest cultural heights at the very moment its political foundations begin to crumble. That paradox has few better examples than the final decades of the Habsburg monarchy. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the monarchy appeared increasingly fragile. National rivalries grew sharper every year. Political compromise became harder to achieve. The old emperor, Franz Joseph I of Austria, seemed like a relic from another age, presiding over a state that was slowly becoming impossible to govern. And yet, at precisely that moment, Vienna was becoming one of the greatest centers of creativity the modern world has ever known. It was the empire's golden autumn, a season of astonishing beauty that arrived just before the winter. Walk through Vienna around the year 1900, and you would find yourself in one of history's most extraordinary cities. Elegant cafes lined broad boulevards, horse-drawn carriages rolled past glittering palaces and magnificent museums. Students debated politics deep into the night. Artists challenged tradition. Scientists questioned accepted truths. Musicians searched for sounds no one had heard before. It seemed as though the entire modern world was being imagined within a few square miles. In a modest consulting room, a neurologist named Sigmund Freud was developing ideas that would forever change humanity's understanding of the mind. Dreams, memory, desire, and the unconscious became subjects of scientific inquiry, influencing psychology, philosophy, literature, and culture for generations. Across the city, another revolution unfolded on canvas. Gustav Klimt and fellow artists founded the Vienna Secession, rejecting the rigid traditions of the old academies. Their work embraced symbolism, beauty, and bold experimentation, helping redefine modern art. Music evolved just as dramatically. At the Imperial Opera, Gustav Mahler pushed orchestras to extraordinary emotional heights, while younger composers began dismantling centuries-old musical conventions, opening the door to 20th-century music. The city's famous coffeehouses became far more than places to drink coffee. They were meeting places where writers, philosophers, economists, journalists, and politicians exchanged ideas that would shape the future. Among them were figures such as Stefan Zweig, who observed the dazzling cosmopolitan world that would soon disappear forever, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose ideas would transform modern philosophy. Architects such as Otto Wagner abandoned centuries of ornament in favor of clean lines and practical beauty, laying the foundations of modern architecture. Looking back, it almost seems impossible. So many of the ideas that shaped the 20th century were emerging simultaneously from one remarkable city. Vienna was not merely witnessing the birth of the modern age, it was helping create it. Yet beneath that dazzling brilliance, darker forces were gathering. The empire's many nationalities increasingly challenged the authority of Vienna. Every political compromise produced fresh demands. Parliament descended into bitter obstruction. Nationalist movements grew louder. The unity that had held the empire together for centuries slowly began to dissolve. The atmosphere in the streets also changed. Populist politicians increasingly blamed minorities for society's problems, especially Vienna's thriving Jewish community, whose members had contributed enormously to the city's scientific, artistic, financial, and intellectual achievements. Old prejudices found new political power. The poisonous language of racial nationalism spread with alarming speed. Among the thousands of young men drifting through Vienna during these years was an unsuccessful artist from Linz. Twice rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts, he absorbed many of the resentments and extremist ideas circulating through the city's political culture. His name was Adolf Hitler. Few who passed him on the streets could have imagined the destruction he would one day unleash upon Europe. That is what makes this moment so haunting. The Vienna of 1900 produced extraordinary beauty and extraordinary danger at exactly the same time. The same streets echoed with symphonies and political hatred. The same cafes nurtured brilliant ideas and dangerous ideologies. The same empire that gave the modern world some of its greatest achievements was unknowingly approaching the catastrophe that would destroy it. only one spark remained. A single assassin, a single morning in the city of Sarajevo, and 6 centuries of Habsburg history would finally come to an end. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand plunged Europe into the First World War, a conflict unlike anything the continent had ever experienced. What many believed would be a short war instead became years of industrial slaughter that consumed millions of lives and exhausted every great power involved. The aged Franz Joseph I of Austria did not live to see the end. After ruling for 68 years, he died in 1916, in the middle of the greatest war Europe had ever known, a war his own empire had helped unleash. The crown passed to his grandnephew, Charles I of Austria. Charles inherited almost nothing except impossible choices. The armies were exhausted. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. Entire populations were growing desperate. Across the empire, nationalist movements no longer demanded reforms. They demanded independence. Charles tried desperately to save what remained. He secretly reached out to the Allied powers, hoping to negotiate a separate peace behind Germany's back. The effort failed. He proposed sweeping reforms that would grant greater autonomy to the empire's many peoples. But by then, compromise came too late. The forces pulling Austria-Hungary apart had become unstoppable. As the autumn of 1918 unfolded, the empire dissolved with astonishing speed. The Czechs proclaimed an independent Czechoslovakia. Hungary separated. The South Slavs united into a new kingdom. Province after province slipped beyond Habsburg control. After more than 6 centuries of expansion, diplomacy, dynastic marriages, military victories, and remarkable survival, the empire simply unraveled. In November 1918, Charles withdrew from the affairs of state. He deliberately avoided using the word abdication, refusing to abandon the hope that one day his people might call him back. But everyone understood what it meant. The Habsburg monarchy had come to an end. Exile followed. Charles made 2 determined attempts to recover the Hungarian throne, but both failed. The victorious Allied powers eventually sent him to the remote Atlantic island of Madeira. There, stripped of empire, wealth, and political influence, he died in 1922 at just 34 years of age. The dynasty that had once ruled much of Europe could no longer even rule itself. And so ended one of history's most extraordinary political experiments. The Habsburgs survived rival dynasties, crusades, religious wars, Ottoman invasions, revolutions, and the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. They succeeded not because they were always the greatest generals, but because they mastered patience, diplomacy, and long-term strategy. For centuries, they understood that a carefully arranged marriage could accomplish what decades of warfare could not. They played the longest political game in Europe, and for generations, they kept winning. Yet the very strategy that built their greatness also planted the seeds of decline. The determination to preserve power within the family weakened the dynasty through generations of intermarriage. Their determination to govern dozens of different peoples eventually collided with the unstoppable rise of nationalism. In the end, the House of Habsburg was defeated not by one empire or one battlefield, but by a changing world. It had ruled for more than 600 years. It had shaped the destinies of kings. It had redrawn the map of Europe. It had stood at the center of wars, alliances, religious conflicts, and diplomatic triumphs that transformed an entire continent. And it had all begun with a modest stone fortress overlooking a Swiss river, a castle built by an obscure count, a family few expected to matter. 6 centuries later, that family had become one of the greatest dynasties in human history. The Hawk's Castle is quiet now, but the name it gave the world, the House of Habsburg, continues to echo through European history. Its empire is gone. Its crowns have long since disappeared. But its legacy remains woven into the story of Europe itself. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to explore more fascinating stories about the empires, rulers, and events that shaped our world, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary.